Freedom is never voluntarily given by the oppressor. It must be demanded by the oppressed. 60 years ago, Martin Luther King Jr. spoke those words, and today on African soil, they echo with a new kind of fire. Picture this: a continent of 1.4 billion people, long forced to travel the digital highways owned and taxed by Silicon Valley, suddenly flips the switch and builds its own. No more emails routed across Europe before reaching your neighbor. No more hidden fees funneled to shareholders in San Francisco. No more history of Napoleon showing up before the history of the Mali Empire on the very continent where that history was born. On that night, the glow of fiber optic cables stretched across deserts and jungles, lighting up a new reality. Africa was no longer renting space on someone else's infrastructure. It was building an internet of its own. And this was never just about faster Wi-Fi. It was about dignity, power, and who gets to decide the future. Yet here lies the paradox. When Americans speak of self-reliance, it is celebrated as a virtue. But when young leaders like Burkina Faso's Ibrahim Traoré demand sovereignty, whether in gold, in food, or in data, they are met with suspicion, even hostility. So the question for us, especially for those who lived through the Cold War and the Civil Rights era, is this: is Africa's digital revolution truly a threat to the world order, or is it the beginning of a fairer one? If you believe this turning point deserves to be heard, hit the like button and share your thoughts in the comments. And if you want to be among the first to witness Africa's journey from its gold to its grain to its data, make sure to subscribe. Because the truth is always more important than the headlines. Before we can understand the shock of Africa's digital revolution, we must first remember the old reality. For decades, every message, every payment, every search query from Africa had to travel thousands of miles across the Atlantic, bounce through servers in Europe or the United States, and only then return to the neighbor next door. Imagine mailing a letter to your cousin across the street, but first sending it through Paris or New York before it could arrive in his hands. That was the daily experience of hundreds of millions of Africans. This architecture was not just inefficient, it was punishing. Families in Burkina Faso often spent a disproportionate share of their income simply to keep their children connected for school. Students in Nairobi waited minutes for textbooks that downloaded in seconds in Boston. Businesses in Lagos watched their profits leak away in the form of inflated digital transaction fees. Africa, in effect, was paying rent to use the roads of someone else's empire. And who collected the tolls? The same names that dominate our own lives here in the West: Google, Microsoft, Amazon. These were not neutral service providers. They were gatekeepers. They decided what Africans could access, how quickly information traveled, and which voices were amplified. An African teenager searching for the Mali Empire would be more likely to find essays about Napoleon than the chronicles of his own ancestors. The knowledge of a continent was being filtered through algorithms written thousands of miles away. It was a digital mirror of a much older pattern. For centuries, Africa's resources, gold, cotton, cocoa, oil, flowed outward, while wealth and influence flowed in the opposite direction. Now, even data, the invisible gold of the 21st century, was leaving the continent as fast as it could be produced. The internet, once promised as a borderless commons, had become another chain of dependency. This is where Ibrahim Traoré enters the story. Still in his mid-30s, the young president of Burkina Faso began to speak of sovereignty in unusual terms. Not only sovereignty over the soil or the mines, but sovereignty over knowledge and information. He told his people that freedom meant nothing if their minds, their data, their very words were still passing through the gates of foreign corporations. His message was simple, yet radical: sovereignty must be built into the foundations of life, from the gold beneath the ground to the data flowing through cables. Traoré laid out two paths. The first was familiar safety through dependence. Under this model, Burkina Faso and its neighbors would continue to pay inflated fees to foreign shareholders, endure slower connections, and accept a digital reality designed elsewhere. It was predictable, but it guaranteed perpetual subordination. The second path was untested and dangerous: freedom through risk. It meant building Africa's own digital highways, laying over 100,000 kilometers of fiber optic cables, and constructing 47 major data centers across the continent. It required a protocol deliberately incompatible with Silicon Valley's systems so that Africa's internet would never again be dependent on the indexing or cloud storage of Google or Microsoft. This was no small step. It was costly, uncertain, and sure to provoke resistance from powerful forces abroad. But it also promised something no one had dared to dream: control jobs' dignity. The math alone was staggering. Every year, Africa lost nearly $50 billion paying foreign companies for digital services. If that money stayed on the continent, it could employ engineers, fund startups, build schools, and circulate within local economies. For the farmer in Ouagadougou, using an app designed in his own language, the change would mean better harvests and fairer markets. For the student in Nairobi, it would mean seeing African history on the first page of search results, not buried under Western narratives. At first, many dismissed the vision as impossible. Critics said African infrastructure was too weak, too fragmented, too poor to sustain such an ambitious network. But slowly, as cables were laid across deserts and jungles and data centers rose in capitals from Dakar to Addis Ababa, belief began to replace skepticism. What had once seemed a fantasy was turning into a blueprint for independence. And so the stage was set. The choice was no longer theoretical, it was real, visible, and humming with electricity beneath the soil. For the first time, Africa was not being asked to rent space in someone else's empire. It was being asked to decide, will we remain passengers on the digital highways of the West, or will we build roads of our own? The turning point came not in silence, but in a thunderclap. When Africa's new digital network went live, the world expected a slow, hesitant adoption. Analysts in New York and London predicted it would take years for Africans to trust the system, years more to build up enough users to matter. They were wrong. Within 72 hours of launch, more than 200 million Africans had migrated to the new network. No digital platform in history, not Facebook, not TikTok, not WhatsApp, had ever seen such rapid adoption. It was unprecedented, a shockwave that tore through Silicon Valley. Google's executives scrambled into emergency meetings. Microsoft's cloud engineers convened crisis teams. For the first time, the world's most powerful tech corporations were not setting the terms of competition. They were being locked out of an entire continent. Why? Because the new African internet was deliberately designed to be incompatible. Google's crawlers could not index it. Microsoft's cloud services could not penetrate it. The monopoly was broken at the root. And just like that, what had once seemed unthinkable became irreversible. Africa had severed the cords that bound its knowledge, its culture, and its economy to servers thousands of miles away. The reaction abroad was immediate and fierce. In Washington, lawmakers debated whether this new digital sovereignty posed a threat to U.S. national security. Some called it a reckless experiment that could fragment the global internet. Others feared it was the beginning of a world where Western influence would no longer dominate. European capitals echoed the alarm. Paris and London worried not only about economics, but about cultural power losing the ability to shape narratives in regions they once ruled. Headlines screamed about a splintered internet and the balkanization of cyberspace, framing Africa's independence not as progress, but as danger. Yet the crisis was not in Africa. The crisis was in Silicon Valley. The corporations that once dictated the rules were now scrambling to catch up. Stock prices wavered as investors asked hard questions. Could Google and Microsoft remain global powers if an entire continent rejected their services? What would stop South America or Asia from following Africa's example? Inside Africa, the mood was the opposite. The launch was greeted with astonishment and pride. In Ouagadougou, university students flooded social media with triumphant posts. For the first time, the internet feels like it's ours. In Nairobi, classrooms streamed lectures without interruption. In Lagos, small businesses saved money as payment systems no longer detoured through Europe. Across the continent, the change was not abstract. It was lived reality. Families no longer had to choose between groceries and school internet fees. Doctors in rural clinics shared patient data securely without foreign surveillance. Each improvement seemed small on its own, but together they painted a portrait of freedom made tangible. For Ibrahim Traoré, the moment was both vindication and test. Standing before his people, he declared, "Dependence ends the day we decide it ends." His words spread like wildfire across African social media, chanted at rallies, painted on murals, and turned into viral hashtags. They became a shield against doubt and a rallying cry for courage. Young Africans clipped his speech into 5-second videos of triumph, defiance, and pride snippets that circled the world faster than any press release. But even as celebrations swept the continent, the questions grew sharper. Could Africa withstand the pressure that was surely coming? Would sanctions follow as they had whenever nations challenged the established order? Would African governments resist the temptation to use their newfound control to silence dissent, replacing one form of dependency with another form of oppression? The excitement was real, but so was the risk. Still, the feeling was undeniable. History was turning. What once seemed a distant dream had become a visible reality. And for the first time in memory, it was the West that appeared unsettled, scrambling, and reactive, while Africa stood tall, unapologetic, and unafraid. The climax of the story was not just in the numbers, but in the symbolism, a young continent, long underestimated, now choosing its own path and daring the world to adapt. If the climax was measured in numbers, 200 million people shifting platforms in 3 days, the consequences were measured in lives. The internet revolution was not confined to headlines or stock prices. It unfolded in homes, classrooms, farms, and parliaments across Africa. For ordinary families, the change was immediate and practical. In Burkina Faso, parents who once spent a painful share of their monthly income just to keep children online for school suddenly found the costs slashed. What had been a luxury became a necessity within reach. In Nairobi, students streamed lectures without interruption, no longer at the mercy of overloaded transatlantic cables. In Lagos, entrepreneurs noticed transaction fees drop as payments no longer detoured through Europe. These were not abstract victories. They were tangible improvements that touched daily survival, education, food, business, health. The digital shift also carried an economic revolution. Nearly $50 billion that once flowed outward each year to American and European corporations now circulated at home. Data centers employed African engineers, not foreign contractors. Fiber optic projects created jobs for local workers, from technicians in Dakar to welders in Ouagadougou. Startups sprang up almost overnight, catering to needs once ignored by Western platforms. Apps in native languages, platforms for local farmers, search engines that prioritized African scholarship. For the first time, Africa was not only a consumer of technology, but a producer, a creator shaping its own digital future. Politically, the ripple effects were no less profound. Leaders across the continent seized upon the success as proof that sovereignty was not just a slogan. Parliaments debated digital charters alongside mining contracts. Civil society groups began demanding transparency. If Africa now controlled its own networks, those networks must not become tools of domestic censorship. In Accra, activists painted murals declaring, "Our data, our destiny." In Addis Ababa, journalists used the new system to share stories without fear of Western surveillance. The debate shifted from whether sovereignty was possible to how sovereignty should be governed. Of course, not all consequences were celebratory. The revolution exposed deep divides. Some African governments, tempted by newfound control, moved quickly to restrict opposition voices online. Civil liberties groups warned of trading one master for another, exchanging Western algorithms for domestic political filters. The tension between independence and accountability became the central question. Could Africa build an internet that was both sovereign and free, or would digital freedom be sacrificed on the altar of national control? Internationally, the political consequences were dramatic. Western governments, unnerved by the speed of the shift, accused Africa of destabilizing the global digital order. Washington considered sanctions under the banner of cybersecurity. Paris warned of fragmentation. Yet these criticisms only fueled African pride. In speeches from Dakar to Dar es Salaam, leaders pointed out the hypocrisy. When Europe defended its sovereignty, it was called prudence. When Africa defended its sovereignty, it was called dangerous. The double standard became impossible to ignore. At the same time, new alliances began to form. South American leaders studied Africa's model, hinting at their own continental networks. In Asia, governments quietly praised the move as proof that digital independence was possible even against trillion-dollar corporations. Africa's experiment had become a global precedent. For the United States, the civil and political consequences were unsettling. America, which once saw itself as the champion of freedom, now faced the image of a young African leader declaring independence in ways that echoed the language of Martin Luther King Jr. and the Founding Fathers. Older Americans watching could not help but draw comparisons. This was Africa's Boston Tea Party, its Montgomery bus boycott, its declaration that enough was enough. The internet revolution, in short, blurred the line between civil life and political destiny. It was not just about cheaper Wi-Fi or faster downloads. It was about whether a farmer, a student, a small business owner could finally live free from invisible tolls. It was about whether nations long treated as tenants on someone else's property could at last become landlords of their own future. From Washington to Brussels, Africa's digital uprising landed like a thunderbolt. The U.S., long accustomed to framing the internet as an American invention and natural extension of its influence, suddenly found itself confronted with a reality it could neither control nor ignore. The very corporations that symbolized American power, Google, Microsoft, Amazon, were losing their grip on 1.4 billion potential users. In Congress, hearings turned tense. Lawmakers asked whether Africa's move was a threat to national security. Should America sanction those who dared to cut ties with Silicon Valley? Should the State Department pressure allies to resist African platforms? Some argued for punishment, others for negotiation. But beneath the policy debates lay a deeper anxiety. America's soft power had cracked. What was once automatic loyalty to U.S. technology was now voluntary, and Africans had chosen to walk away. Europe reacted with its own unease. Paris and London, already fearful of losing influence in West and East Africa, watched as their cultural leverage slipped. For decades, European narratives had dominated African classrooms, libraries, and online spaces. Now, with African-built networks prioritizing local scholarship, European voices found themselves competing on equal footing. The loss was not only economic but symbolic, a crumbling of the last remnants of colonial tutelage. Yet beyond the West, the reactions were markedly different. In South America, leaders in Brazil and Argentina openly praised Africa's boldness. If Africa can do it, why can't we? Became a refrain in regional discussions. Across Asia, governments experimenting with their own sovereign networks took note. Africa's success provided proof that independence from Western monopolies was not only possible but achievable at scale. This global shift terrified Western policymakers because it hinted at something larger, the end of a single unified internet dominated by a handful of corporations. Instead, the world might be entering an era of regional ecosystems, each sovereign, each accountable to its own people. For the West, that meant the loss of cultural hegemony. For others, it meant correction justice long overdue. Back in the United States, the story resonated differently with older Americans. Many remembered the oil crises of the 1970s when dependence on foreign energy left the country vulnerable. Others remembered the collapse of local factories when jobs were outsourced overseas. Still others recalled the 2008 financial crash when decisions made in Wall Street skyscrapers rippled through small-town America. In each case, dependence proved fragile. Sovereignty, whether in oil jobs or finance, was not a luxury, it was survival. So when they saw President Ibrahim Traoré of Burkina Faso declaring that sovereignty must extend to data and digital life, many Americans felt a paradoxical sense of recognition. The language was African, but the heartbeat was universal, a people refusing to remain dependent, demanding control over their destiny. For Americans who once lived through the civil rights movement, the echoes were unmistakable. Traoré's rallying cry, "Dependence ends the day we decide it ends," could have been spoken in Montgomery or Selma as easily as in Ouagadougou. Globally, the revolution forced a reckoning. The internet, once imagined as a borderless commons, was now a battlefield of sovereignty. For Africa, it was a birthright reclaimed. For the West, it was a threat to centuries of unchallenged influence. For the rest of the world, it was an invitation to reimagine freedom in the digital age. Picture this, the lights of Ouagadougou glowing against the night sky while beneath the earth fiber optic cables pulse with more than just data, they pulse with destiny. For the first time in modern history, Africans are not passengers on someone else's digital highway. They are drivers building roads of their own. But every road has crossroads. Africa's internet revolution is no exception. The promise is dazzling cheaper access, fairer markets, knowledge rooted in African voices. Yet the risks are real. External pressure will be fierce sanctions, disinformation campaigns, corporate lobbying designed to break the new system from within. Internal temptations will be just as dangerous, governments tempted to use sovereignty as a shield for censorship or corruption. Sovereignty, as Ibrahim Traoré reminds us, requires discipline, not only defiance. The warning is clear: if Africa's leaders betray the trust of their people, this digital independence could collapse into another form of control, just with new masters. But if they succeed, if they guard liberty as fiercely as they built the cables, then this revolution will not only endure, it will spread. Already South America and Asia are watching closely. The balance of global power could tilt not with tanks or bombs, but with fiber optics and code. For older Americans, the parallels are striking. This moment may feel like the civil rights marches of the 1960s, when ordinary people demanded dignity against impossible odds. It may recall the fall of the Berlin Wall when a single night reshaped a continent. The imagery is different, but the heartbeat is the same: people refusing to remain defined by someone else's system. So the question now reaches beyond Africa. What would you choose for your own nation? Safety, independence, or risk in freedom? Would you accept convenience at the price of control, or demand sovereignty, even when it costs more in the short term? These are not African questions alone. They are questions every free society must ask in an age where invisible infrastructure shapes our lives. If you believe this turning point deserves to be remembered, add your voice. Share this story so that it travels further than any cable. Leave a comment with what you felt so others may see through your eyes. And if you want to be among the first to witness the next chapter of this global struggle for sovereignty, hit subscribe. Because history is not written only by leaders. It is written by those who choose to witness, to remember, and to carry the truth forward. And today, Africa's truth is blazing a path the whole world must decide whether to follow.